December 20th, 1941. Kunming Airfield, Yunnan Province, southern China. The morning fog still clings to the mountains, rolling down toward a cracked runway of dirt and stone. Mechanics in torn jackets move through the mist, their breath turning white in the cold. One by one, they brush frost from the noses of the P-40 Warhawks, each painted with a snarling shark's mouth. From a distance, farmers and children stop their work and stare. To them, these machines are monsters of thunder, carrying the hope of a wounded country. A little boy points upward as the first engine roars alive, echoing across the valley. Inside the cockpit, a man tightens his leather gloves. His name is Eric Schilling, former U.S. Army Air Corps pilot, now a volunteer. No insignia on his shoulder, no flag on his plane, only the teeth of a shark, and a promise he made when he saw Japanese bombers torching Chinese villages months before. On a radio captured from the enemy, a voice crackles in Japanese. "China's sky is ours." The pilot glances toward the horizon. He knows the bombers will come again. They always do. And today, someone has to meet them. He pushes the throttle. The P-40 shudders, spits black smoke, then surges forward. Tires grind on gravel. The shark mouth rises into the gray sky. 3 more Warhawks follow. Their tails flash white against the clouds, the only color left in this tired land. Down below, villagers cheer. They don't know who these men are, only that they fly for them. The airfield disappears beneath a blanket of fog. The radio goes silent. Only the rhythm of the engine remains, steady, defiant, American. They were not soldiers of any nation. Yet, they came to fight a war the world hadn't acknowledged. And as their shadows vanish into the sun, none of them, not even Chennault, the man who trained them, could know what history was about to witness. He didn't know this moment would rewrite everything. Between 1937 and 1941, the sky over China belonged to Japan. From the first bombs that fell on Shanghai to the firestorms over Chongqing, the Japanese Army Air Service ruled the air, fast, organized, and merciless. Their Mitsubishi G3M bombers crossed mountains and rivers at will. Their A6M-0s swept aside the few Chinese planes that rose to meet them. For the people below, there was no escape. By the time America was still at peace, the cities of Nanking, Canton, and Chongqing had become open-air furnaces. In those years, Japan believed China had already died in the sky. Reports from Tokyo described the enemy's air force as a corpse without wings. They had reason to think so. China's pilots were outnumbered, undertrained, and flying outdated biplanes that were older than the pilots themselves. But far from the headlines, one man was watching. A retired U.S. Army Air Corps captain named Claire Lee Chennault, once dismissed as a stubborn tactician back home. Chennault had come to China in 1937 to train a few desperate cadets for Chiang Kai-shek's government. He studied Japanese formations, recorded the timing of raids, even sketched Zero silhouettes by hand. His notebook, now faded with sweat and oil, carried a single line written in pencil. The world was blind to what was coming. But I had seen the Zero. By 1941, Chennault was certain. Japan's pilots were not invincible, only predictable. What China needed wasn't numbers. It needed precision, discipline, and speed. When war clouds gathered over the Pacific, Chennault made a bold proposal. He would build a volunteer force, Americans, trained outside U.S. command, to fly for China before America itself went to war. Through secret contracts funded by the Chinese government and approved quietly in Washington, 100 pilots resigned from the U.S. Navy, Marine Corps, and Army Air Corps. They packed their uniforms, boarded civilian ships, and disappeared from official records. Their destination, Rangoon, Burma. Their mission, to stop the Japanese from cutting China's last lifeline. The Burma Road. There, amid jungle heat and monsoon rain, Chennault shaped his experiment into something new. the American Volunteer Group, or AVG. He divided them into 3 squadrons, each with a name that sounded more like rebellion than military order. Adam and Eve, Panda Bears, Hell's Angels. They assembled their Curtiss P-40 Warhawks from crates, piece by piece, under corrugated tin roofs. The paint they used for the shark mouths came from a Burmese hardware shop. Their headquarters was a bamboo hut with a radio, a map, and one determined man with a pipe clenched between his teeth. Every evening, Chennault stood before his pilots and spoke not about heroism, but math. He drew diagrams in the dirt. Attack from the sun, dive at full power, never turn with a 0. He knew their planes were heavier and slower. But they could take hits the Zeros couldn't survive. To the Japanese, they would soon appear as ghosts. Foreign fighters with shark faces, striking from nowhere and vanishing into the clouds. No one outside a handful of officers in Chungking and Washington even knew they existed. To the world, China still had no air force. To Japan, the skies were still theirs. And so, as 1941 reached its end, the Imperial Army prepared another bombing run over Kunming, confident that nothing could stop them. They had no idea that hidden among the mountains, a handful of Americans were already warming their engines. December 20th, 1941. Kunming, China. It began as a whisper in the clouds. A lookout on the northern ridge spots 10 dots moving south. Japanese Mitsubishi Ki-21. Sally bombers, flying in perfect formation, their bellies glinting in the morning sun. Behind them, a dozen escort fighters. Nakajima Ki-27S, light and fast, their wingtips slicing through the haze. The air raid alarm wails across the valley. Civilians scatter for the caves. On the field below, ground crews sprint toward the Warhawks. Chennault's men had trained for this, but never faced it. 3 of them climb into their cockpits, Major John Newkirk, Charles Older, and Tex Hill. They strap in, faces streaked with oil and sweat, the shark mouths of their Curtiss P-40B Warhawks glistening with dew. Engines roar alive. 1, 2, 3. The propellers blur into silver discs as they roll down the uneven runway. Mud and gravel spray behind them. "Hell's Angels, clear for takeoff," a voice cracks over the radio. Bandits inbound from the north. Altitude 15,000 feet. They pull up into the clouds. Sunlight flashes across the shark teeth painted on their noses, a symbol borrowed from the British in North Africa, now reborn in Asia. High above, the Japanese formation flies steady, confident. They have bombed Kunming before, without a single loss. No enemy has ever reached them. But this time, the sky is different. From the blinding light of the sun, 3 Warhawks dive. Guns blaze. 6 50 caliber Brownings tear through the air. Tracer fire streaks down like meteors. The lead bomber explodes in midair, its left wing folding like paper. Another spirals downward, engine screaming. In seconds, the perfect Japanese formation turns into chaos. "Brake! Brake right!" A Zero pilot shouts in panic. But the Warhawks are already gone. Diving them through the smoke, banking low, vanishing behind the hills. Below, villagers emerge from their shelters and look up. They see fire falling from the sky. The impossible has happened. Japanese bombers are burning over China. "Fei Hu! Fei Hu!" they shout. "Flying Tigers!" The nickname spreads faster than the flames. Even the American pilots don't know what it means yet. But the sound of it, echoing through the valley, tells them everything. In less than 10 minutes, 9 enemy bombers are down. The survivors turn back toward Hanoi, their formation shattered. Kunming is safe. For the first time in years, Chinese skies are defended. That night, inside a bamboo barrack lit by one lantern, Lieutenant Charles Older writes in his notebook, "We came here for adventure. Today, we saw what freedom costs." He pauses, the pen trembling. Outside, villagers place candles along the airfield fence. A silent thank you to strangers who came from a world away. Chennault walks among them, pipe in hand, looking up at the dark sky. He knows the Japanese will come again. But tonight, for the first time, they were stopped. By sunset, the surviving Warhawks limp home. Bullet holes along their wings. Mechanics rush forward, counting the damage. 3 planes, 3 men, all alive. Claire Lee Chennault stands at the edge of the runway, pipe smoke curling in the cold air. He says nothing. He only nods once as the pilots climb down. Exhausted, faces streaked with grime and disbelief. Behind them, the mountain horizon glows a faint orange. The last fires of fallen bombers still burning miles away. The smell of oil, cordite, and victory hangs heavy in the air. Word spreads through Kunming overnight. In the markets, in temples, in refugee shelters. People whisper the same 2 words, Fei Hu. Children carve shark mouths into bamboo toys. Fishermen paint them on the sides of their boats. By morning, newspapers in Chongqing report, Foreign eagles save Kunming. 9 enemy bombers destroyed. The Japanese military censors the news, but fragments leak out. Intercepted radio logs describe foreign mercenaries with unmatched discipline. Tokyo intelligence calls them the American devils. But inside Japan's command rooms, there's confusion. Who are these pilots? How did China, supposedly crippled in the air, strike back so suddenly? For years, their intelligence maps marked Kunming as undefended. Now those same maps are wrong. Their doctrine, built on air superiority, begins to crack. One Japanese officer writes in his log that night, They appeared from the sun, machines with teeth. We never saw them coming. While Tokyo struggles to understand, in Burma and China, the AVG celebrates quietly. No medals, no press. Only a chalkboard on a hut wall. 9 red rising suns crossed out with white paint. Tex Hill leans against a wing, sipping lukewarm tea, and murmurs, Not bad for a day's work. But Chennault knows what's next. He gathers his men around a map lit by a single bulb. He points north. Tomorrow, he says, they'll come again. Next time, more bombers, more fighters. They'll want revenge. He looks at each pilot in turn. These volunteers, adventurers, dreamers who left home before the war even started. Remember your training, he says softly. Dive from the sun. Hit hard. Then go home alive. Later that night, one of the Chinese mechanics writes a letter to his brother. The foreigners fight for us, though our language is strange. When they fly, the sky feels safe again. It is the first time in 5 years that the sentence could be written. Over the next weeks, Chennault's flying tigers repeat the miracle. Each battle begins the same. 10, 20 Japanese planes against a handful of Americans. Each ends the same. Smoke trails across the Yunnan sky and cheers from the ground below. The myth of Japanese invincibility begins to die. Not in Tokyo or Washington, but here, above a forgotten airfield in the mountains. And, as the camera pans upward, the sound of the engines fades into the wind. 3 shark-mouthed Warhawks slicing through the clouds. For the first time in years, Chinese skies were defended. To understand how the Flying Tigers did the impossible, you have to look not at the men first, but at their machines. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk was not a perfect fighter. By the standards of 1941, it was already considered old, heavy, underpowered, and blind at high altitudes. But what it lacked in finesse, it made up for in muscle. Its heart was the Allison V-12 engine, a 12-cylinder, liquid-cooled power plant that could push the aircraft beyond 360 miles per hour in level flight, and nearly 480 in a dive. When the pilot shoved the throttle forward, the nose dropped, and gravity became an ally. Few planes on Earth could survive that kind of descent. The Japanese A6M0, elegant and light, would simply tear apart under the same strain. That difference between grace and grit became Chennault's secret weapon. He taught his pilots never to dogfight. Dogfighting, he said, was for romantics, and romantics die fast. Instead, they would fight like hunters. Strike from above, dive hard, fire once, and disappear before the enemy could turn. They called it dive and zoom. At first, the men doubted him. They wanted glory, not mathematics. But Chennault was a strategist who thought in numbers. He pinned charts on the walls of their mess hall, comparing angles, altitude loss, climb rate, and armor thickness. Then he wrote it all down in chalk. 0, faster climb, lighter frame, no armor. Warhawk, slower climb, heavy frame, self-sealing tanks. Solution, never climb, always dive. To the untrained eye, it was simple. To the pilots, it was salvation. Every inch of the P-40 was built for punishment. The fuselage was steel and aluminum. The cockpit sat behind bulletproof glass, and its fuel tanks, lined with rubber, would swell shut if punctured, saving more lives than any miracle. Metric P-40B, Warhawk A6M0, maximum speed 360 mph, 331 mph, dive speed 480 mph, 410 mph, armor, heavy minimal range. 650 miles, 1,100 miles, Chennault knew the Warhawk could never win a turning fight. But in a head-on charge, it was nearly unbreakable. Each carried 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, spitting over 700 rounds per minute. One well-placed burst could rip a Zero clean in half. He made his men memorize the data like gospel. Before every sortie, they studied hand-drawn silhouettes of Japanese aircraft, identifying weak points, radiator, fuel line, cockpit glass. No radar, no computers, just eyes, experience, and the instinct to survive. At night, the AVG trained with models carved from bamboo and clay. Chennault placed them on sand tables, simulating mountain ranges, sun angles, and wind direction. He'd move the Zero model himself and ask, "When do you strike?" If anyone answered too late, he erased the model with his hand and said quietly, "Then you're already dead." The lessons worked. By the end of their first month, his pilots no longer feared the Zero. They hunted it. But victory in the air depended on miracles on the ground. The Warhawks didn't come from American bases. They came by ship, disassembled, crated like furniture, unloaded at Rangoon Harbor in Burma. Each plane was taken apart into 6 major sections: wings, tail, fuselage, engine, propeller, and guns. From there, they traveled 700 miles by truck along the treacherous Burma Road, a twisting ribbon of dirt through mountains and jungle. Bridges collapsed, trucks flipped, drivers fought off malaria and bandits. Every Warhawk that reached Kunming was a small victory before it even flew. Sound. Truck gears grind. Monsoon rain in the distance. Where ITAS mechanics, both American and Chinese, worked by lantern light, reassembling planes piece by piece. They used hammers, spare bolts, even wire from telegraph poles. When fuel ran low, they siphoned it from broken generators. By Chennault's math, each combat flight required 600 gallons of fuel, 3 tons of ammunition, and 20 hours of maintenance. One sortie could empty a village's entire supply of gasoline. Still, the planes flew, and each flight struck another wound into Japan's myth of invincibility. For the Flying Tigers, victory was not magic. It was arithmetic, sweat, and will. And Chennault, Mercenaries knew. In industrial war, survival depended not on brilliance, but on logistics. By early 1942, the Flying Tigers War was being fought as much on the ground as in the sky. Every mission started with a problem no textbook could solve: how to keep 100 fighters alive in the middle of nowhere. The supply chain that fed Chennault's squadron was a patchwork miracle. From factories in Buffalo and Detroit, crated engines and spare parts traveled by rail across America, then by ship across the Pacific to Rangoon. Once unloaded, They began the hardest leg, the Burma Road. 700 miles of mud and mountain. Narrow bridges sagging under truck convoys. Drivers steering through monsoon storms with headlights off to avoid Japanese scouts. If a single bridge collapsed, a whole squadron could be grounded. Fuel came in 50-gallon drums, rolled by hand up muddy slopes. Mechanics rationed every drop like medicine. Sometimes they mixed aviation gas with kerosene just to keep the engines turning. Chennault kept meticulous records. Fuel flow, ammunition weight, man-hours per sortie. He called it industrial arithmetic. Each Warhawk required 600 gallons of fuel, 3 tons of ammunition, and 20 hours of maintenance for every hour in combat. That meant every victory in the air cost an army of unseen laborers below. To stretch their supplies, the Tigers learned to reuse everything. Propeller blades were straightened with hammers. Tires were patched with strips of leather. Empty .50 caliber casings were cleaned, refilled, and fired again. A wrecked Warhawk was stripped bare within hours. Its radios, guns, and even seat belts transplanted into another aircraft. Nothing was wasted. Every nut and bolt carried the weight of survival. At Kunming, the main airfield was little more than a dirt strip carved from the hillside. When it rained, the runway turned to soup. To take off, ground crews laid bamboo mats under the wheels, shouting and waving flashlights to guide the pilots. To land, the flyers had to guess where the ground began and the mist ended. Still, they flew. Inside the command tent, Chennault would crouch over a sand table, a model carved from river clay and painted by hand. He'd place tiny wooden aircraft on wire sticks, tracing their paths with a matchstick. Sunrise came through the canvas roof, and the men watched the light fall exactly where it would on the real battlefield. No radar, no computers, just a handful of maps printed in English and Chinese, the rest drawn in pencil by reconnaissance pilots. Every photo was taken by hand-cranked cameras bolted to the side of a cockpit. Film rolls were developed in a wash basin behind the mess hall. On them, you could see the enemy's airfields, the long rows of zeros waiting for orders. Each night, Chennault studied those images under a magnifying glass, a cigarette burning between his fingers. He wasn't guessing. He was counting. Counting runways, aircraft, fuel tanks, and the rhythm of the raids. To him, air warfare was a pattern. And patterns could be broken. He built his playbook not from theory, but from exhaustion. Don't fight them where they are strong, he told his men. Fight them where they think you can't reach. And so, when Japanese bombers lifted off from Hanoi, Chennault already knew the hour, altitude, and route. His pilots would climb above the clouds, wait in the glare of the sun, and strike from behind. Dive, shoot, vanish. It was mechanical, methodical, merciless. The men began to see it his way. Tex Hill called it flying by numbers. Charles Older said, "Every time we went up, it felt like beating the odds of physics." They were learning that victory wasn't about daring. It was about discipline. In a war defined by chaos, the Flying Tigers had turned logistics into strategy. They fought not just with courage, but with calibration. Every bullet, every gallon of gas, every hour of daylight, measured, predicted, spent with intent. And for Chennault, that was the point. He wasn't just teaching men to fly. He was proving that even in a war of machines, organization could be a weapon. By the spring of 1942, the difference between life and death in the skies over China came down to design. Numbers, rivets, and physics. The Japanese A6M0 was the purest expression of air superiority. Light, agile, beautiful. Its thin aluminum skin and broad wings gave it unmatched lift. It could outturn anything the Allies had, at least on paper. But that beauty hid a flaw. The Zero's frame had no armor plate, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and little protection for the pilot. One bullet in the wrong place, and the entire aircraft became a torch. The American P-40 Warhawk, on the other hand, was the opposite. Brute force over elegance. Thick armor, heavy control surfaces, a bulletproof windscreen, and weight. Almost 2,000 pounds more than the Zero. It could not turn inside its enemy. But in a dive, it was untouchable. At 480 miles per hour, the air screamed against its wings. The pilot felt his chest crushed into the seat. The Warhawk could dive, shoot, and pull out while the Zero disintegrated trying to follow. Chennault had turned that limitation into doctrine. He explained it in simple physics. The Zero wins the circle. We win the line. The circle meant dogfighting, endless loops and turns. The line meant momentum, speed converted to altitude, altitude to firepower. Dive, zoom, escape, repeat. It wasn't glamorous. It was geometry. Each morning before sunrise, the Flying Tigers gathered around a blackboard. Chennault drew two shapes, a loop for the Zero, a diagonal line for the Warhawk. "Stay out of this," he said, tapping the circle. "Live in this," pointing at the line. To prove it, he demonstrated with toy planes carved from wood, one representing the Zero, one the Warhawk. He threw them in the air. The lighter one spun wildly, the heavier one then sliced straight down. Gravity favored the heavier fighter. The pilots adapted quickly. Instead of chasing, they ambushed. They flew high, invisible above the sun, then dropped like steel hawks. A short burst, 6 Brownings firing, and the enemy vanished in fire. Even the Japanese ace Saburo Sakai would later write in his memoir. The American shark-mouthed planes attacked with terrible speed. Once they began their dive, nothing could touch them. In battle after battle, the pattern held. Over Rangoon, Pegu, and the Salween River, the Warhawks struck, vanished, struck again. In 7 months, the AVG destroyed nearly 300 Japanese aircraft while losing fewer than 24 of their own, a 12-to-1 kill ratio. But behind those numbers were men working through exhaustion. Mechanics slept beside the planes they maintained. Pilots flew twice, sometimes 3 times a day, their arms bruised from the stick. Each victory carved a deeper respect between Americans and the Chinese villagers who watched them fight. When the Tigers returned from a mission, farmers lined the dirt road to greet them, offering fruit, rice wine, or just silent bows. Children traced shark teeth in the dust with sticks. By May, the Japanese finally changed tactics. They began attacking at night, hoping to catch the Warhawks on the ground. Chennault answered by moving his squadrons constantly, hiding aircraft under camouflage nets made of woven reeds. The enemy bombed empty runways. He was proving that strategy could substitute for size, and brains for budgets. Every operation became a calculation. If a sortie used 600 gallons of fuel, that meant 3 trucks on the Burma Road, 10 men hauling drums, and 40 hours of labor. If a Zero cost Japan $30,000 to build and a Warhawk cost $50,000, the Flying Tigers had to make every bullet worth 2. And they did. By summer, the numbers told a story clearer than propaganda ever could. Where Japan had once written, "China has no air," now the reports said, "Air opposition heavy. Shark mouth fighters sighted." That single phrase, "shark mouth fighters," became shorthand for defiance. Chennault stood by his tent one evening, pipe smoke curling into the rain, and watched a Warhawk vanish into cloud. He turned to an aide and said quietly, "They said we were outnumbered. They forgot to count how many times we'd stand back up." The Flying Tigers had proven that in modern war, the difference between destruction and dominance wasn't technology alone. It was the mind that used it. By mid-1942, the Flying Tigers were no longer just a rumor whispered across Asia. They were a legend. In barely 7 months of combat, the American volunteer group, a force that never numbered more than 100 pilots, had destroyed over 250 Japanese aircraft, while losing fewer than 20 of their own. A kill ratio of 12-1. The numbers alone told the story, but the shock ran far deeper. For the first time since the invasion of China, the Japanese military was forced to admit that their vaunted A6M0 was not invincible. Reports from Tokyo described a new kind of enemy, one that attacked from the sun and vanished like ghosts. A Japanese air commander wrote bitterly, "The enemy attacks from the sun, we are blind." That single line captured the collapse of a belief that had defined Japan's air war for 5 years. The myth of the Yasta Sasada unbeatable zero. In Washington, the Flying Tigers became a sensation overnight. Headlines called them America's first heroes of World War II. Magazines printed their photographs, young men in leather jackets leaning against planes with painted shark mouths and cigarette smoke curling in the wind. They looked fearless, almost cinematic. But behind those images was exhaustion. Kunming's airfield was littered with spent shells, oil drums, and the skeletons of engines that had been run to their limits. For every fighter that took off, 3 others were being repaired with scavenged parts. Still, morale soared, not only among the Americans, but across China. To a nation that had suffered years of bombardment, the Flying Tigers symbolized hope. Children waved paper airplanes painted with shark teeth. Artists in Chongqing drew posters showing the Fei Hu diving from clouds, jaws open, protecting the land below. In the Chinese press, their name appeared beside heroes from myth. The 8 Immortals, the Monkey King, and now, the Tigers of the Sky. But inside Chennault's headquarters, the war was changing. The United States had entered the Pacific conflict after Pearl Harbor. New squadrons were arriving, better planes, more men, official uniforms. The days of secrecy were ending. Chennault's volunteers were offered new contracts. They could either return home or join the regular U.S. Army Air Forces. Many chose to stay. On July 4th, 1942, America's Independence Day, the American Volunteer Group officially stood down. Its remaining pilots were absorbed into the U.S. 23rd Fighter Group, part of the newly formed 14th Air Force. The ceremony was quiet. No parade, no band. Just a flag raised under a gray Chinese sky. For some, it was an ending. For others, just another beginning. Tex Hill, one of the Tigers' best, stayed to command a squadron under the new U.S. colors. Chennault himself was promoted to brigadier general and kept in China to lead all American air operations. His Tigers had proven what few in Washington had believed possible, that with discipline, planning, and courage, a small, outnumbered force could cripple an empire's confidence. And perhaps more importantly, they had shown the world that the fight in Asia was not lost. The shark mouth insignia of the Flying Tigers spread with them, painted on every new P-40, and later on the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang. What began as a battlefield decoration became a symbol of Allied air power worldwide. From China to Europe, from North Africa to the South Pacific, pilots carried that grin into battle. A message painted in teeth. We are coming. For Chennault, the real victory was not measured in numbers, but in something far less tangible. Belief. He once told a war correspondent, "We didn't win because we were stronger. We won because we stopped believing we were weak." In Tokyo, the shock took longer to fade than the fires. Japanese pilots returning from Burma and China wrote reports filled with disbelief. One air commander described the new enemy like an omen. They fall from the sun, jaws open, guns flashing. They strike once and vanish. We are hunting ghosts. The myth of the invincible zero, the pride of Japan's aviation, was broken. For the first time, Japanese pilots hesitated before climbing into their cockpits. Morale reports showed the word "fuan," fear appearing for the first time. That fear spread beyond the airfields. At home, newspapers avoided the subject, but rumors leaked through the families of fallen airmen. In the streets of Osaka and Tokyo, people whispered of American phantom squadrons. The Imperial General Staff banned the word Feihu from radio broadcasts, afraid it might inspire defiance among occupied territories. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the Flying Tigers became a symbol of what America believed about itself. In diners, movie theaters, and recruiting offices, their story spread faster than any government propaganda. They were proof that courage and improvisation still mattered, that America could stand up to tyranny even before it was ready for war. Hollywood came calling almost immediately. In 1942, newsreels played grainy footage of shark-mouthed fighters over the clouds. By 1943, posters in Times Square showed the same image with a simple line: Flying Tigers, Guardians of Freedom. John Wayne starred in a film adaptation that same year. It wasn't accurate, few war movies are, but it captured the feeling that Americans needed, that one person could still make a difference. In China, that difference was real. After every successful mission, Chinese villagers would gather at makeshift airfields, bringing food and flowers for the pilots. Children learned a new chant in Mandarin: Fei Hu Lai Lei, the Flying Tigers have come. It echoed from Yunnan to Hunan, a kind of prayer stitched into daily life. For the first time in years, people looked up at the sky without fear. But for the men who lived it, legend came at a cost. When the AVG was absorbed into the U.S. Army Air Forces, the old volunteers felt the change immediately. Gone were the shark tooth insignia they had painted by hand. Now there were regulations, serial numbers, ranks, and paperwork. Some of the original Tigers returned home, carrying scars, fatigue, and a sense that the world no longer understood what they had built. Others stayed, flying under Chennault's command as the 14th Air Force, continuing the fight across China, Burma, and India. Their victories multiplied, but their freedom, that wild spirit of independence, quietly faded. Still, the symbol endured. The shark mouth lived on, first on the P-40, then the P-47 Thunderbolt, the P-51 Mustang, even the A-10 Thunderbolt II. Decades later, it became the face of defiance. The idea that a single fighter, painted with teeth, could bite back against impossible odds. Even today, every pilot who paints that grin on a nose cone carries a fragment of Kunming's sky with him. Short pause, tone reflective. Claire Lee Chennault returned home after the war, older, slower, but unchanged in spirit. In an interview in 1949, when asked what he thought the Tigers' greatest achievement had been, he smiled and said, "We didn't just defend China. We taught the world that belief can fly." Decades later, when veterans of the Flying Tigers met again, they didn't talk about kill counts or medals. They talked about the smell of engine oil in the mountain air, about children waving from rice fields as they took off, about nights spent repairing planes under lantern light, while somewhere above them, the stars burned through the fog. Their story wasn't just about airplanes or aces. It was about the moment a few volunteers changed the course of faith and proved that even in the darkest sky, courage can still find the sun. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the story of the Flying Tigers was already larger than life. But their true legacy wasn't just victory. It was transformation. They had proved that a handful of volunteers, armed with ingenuity and belief, could alter the balance of an entire war. They weren't soldiers of empire or command. They were men who crossed oceans for a cause they chose themselves. And that made them dangerous, not because of their weapons, but because of their adaptability. Chennault's ideas, his obsession with pattern, altitude, and energy, didn't fade with the AVG. They became the foundation of a new way of thinking about air combat. He called it energy fighting. To him, a dogfight wasn't about who turned faster. It was about who managed energy better. Altitude into speed, speed into survival. That doctrine spread quietly through the U.S. Army Air Forces, and after the war, through the newly formed United States Air Force. By the time American pilots were flying over the mountains of Korea a few years later, they were unknowingly fighting the Chennault way, using dive and zoom tactics against MiG-15s, applying mathematics to chaos. 2 decades later, in the jungles of Vietnam, those same principles, adapt, anticipate, strike, withdraw, appeared again in training manuals and dogfight schools. In a world moving from propeller to jet, Chennault's philosophy still held true. Technology changes, but human decision, the instinct to learn faster, wins wars. After the war, Claire Lee Chennault didn't retire into silence. He stayed in Asia, helping rebuild the Republic of China Air Force, training new generations of pilots. He watched the sky fill again with aircraft. But this time, they were protecting, not burning, the cities below. In one of his last interviews, he was asked what the Flying Tigers had really achieved. He thought for a long moment and said, "We showed that courage can be organized, and that freedom can learn." That sentence became his creed. Today, historians study the Flying Tigers not just as heroes, but as a prototype. An early model of the volunteer combat unit, a concept that would echo in future conflicts. From Cold War advisors to modern coalition forces, the spirit of the AVG, small teams, flexible tactics, learning on the fly, became a blueprint for asymmetric warfare. But beyond strategy, the Flying Tigers left something harder to measure. They left a belief that even in industrial war, the power of individuals still mattered. Each shark mouth painted on a jet today, on an A-10 Warthog or an F-15 Eagle, carries that legacy. It's not just decoration. It's memory. Chennault once wrote in his diary, "In industrial war, the speed of learning outweighs the speed of flight." That line was more than observation. It was prophecy, because technology ages overnight. But adaptation, the human ability to adjust, never does. The Flying Tigers taught the world that bravery without learning is waste. But learning with bravery becomes unstoppable. And so, when you look at those grainy photos, the shark-toothed P-40s, the men squinting into the sun, remember this. They didn't just fight for victory. They fought to prove that knowledge itself could take wing. They were paid soldiers, yes, but they fought for something no contract could buy. Claire Lee Chennault, 1945. The war moved on. Empires rose and fell. But the legend of the Flying Tigers never landed. They fought before their nation did. Before Congress declared war. Before the world believed Japan could be stopped. And yet, from a handful of volunteers and a sky of uncertainty, they built something bigger than themselves. When you look at that shark mouth now, on a jet, on a mural, or on the nose of a museum relic, you're not just seeing paint. You're seeing proof that courage can take flight, even before a flag does. This is the legacy of those who flew for freedom before the world caught up. Subscribe to Battle Records to uncover the untold stories of World War II. The battles fought not just with weapons, but with belief.